Um, and with that, welcome everyone to the webinar about managing qualitative data safely and securely. We're very excited to have so many people. I currently see about 40 people in Adobe Connect. This is our first webinar of this nature, and we're very excited to try this out. We hope this is all going smoothly, and if you have any feedback afterwards, we'd be happy to hear it. I'm sitting here with Desi Kirilova, who will do about half of the presentation. We switched twice mid-course. And we have muted all participants, as is common in webinars. We ask you to type any questions in the chat window, and we'll typically take them at the end of every subsections. We will also make the slides available, either send them to you via email or share them on Figshare a couple of days after the webinar. I should mention that this webinar, as we envision it, is oriented towards researchers. I know many of the people who signed up are actually data librarians or otherwise teach or supervise research data management. We hope this is still helpful to you in kind of seeing the researcher's perspective. As you can see kind of from the outline, a lot of what we're going to be talking about are general data management and data management planning considerations, but we always come at this from a qualitative data perspective. Our examples are going to be qualitative data, and some of the issues are unique or specific to qualitative data, particularly in the later sections of the webinar. Now, my bosses have asked me to point out that while we will be talking about legal issues, we aren't lawyers. We don't give legal advice of any type, certainly not beyond the US, but also not for those of you in the US. Now, very briefly, the Qualitative Data Repository. We are a social science data repository, social science broadly construed, that is collecting qualitative and multi-method research data. We're a very young organization. We've only been online since 2014. We do a lot of in-person training in data management in various venues at our Summer Institute, at iAssist, where I think a lot of you are actually heard about the webinar. We have data management guidance documents on our website, which we of course encourage you to visit. But we are of course not the only organization doing these types of things, and we did want to acknowledge kind of from the start that we are, as they say, standing on the shoulder of giants. We work with all our colleagues at various data archives. We've learned a lot from UK data. I think some of the slides actually originated way back in a jointly taught course with UK data, the Irish Qualitative Data Archive, and our more quantitatively oriented US colleagues at ICPSR and the Odum Institute. We talk, we meet at workshops, we meet at conferences, and so this is really kind of a joint institutional undertaking. I want to start out with a simple definition, and data management is actually defined surprisingly rarely. I really like this kind of lofty definition, and it's got a lot of going for it. The first word I want to point to is the caring part. Like a lot of things, if you don't care for your data, it goes bad. So I'm a baker, and so I think of sourdough, right? You need to watch it, you need to make sure it has the right temperature, add flour, add water, etc. And if you do so, you get beautifully baked bread in the end. If you don't do it, it literally stinks. And think of caring for data as a similarly kind of continuous process. And that's the second word that I want to point to. It's throughout the life cycle. It's not something that you do once. It's something that you do from the moment you start envisioning planning your research project all through the end when you hopefully share your data via a data repository. There's some other things in there that I want to point to. The adding value part is something that we think is really important. By doing good data management by having your data well organized, well documented, by having good metadata for your data. You make your data more valuable. You create something more valuable both for yourself and for science as a whole. So why should we do this? And why should we do it well? Well, I have a whole host of reasons, and I'm not going to read those out to you. But I would group them in three kind of broad clusters. You do this for yourself. You don't want to lose your data. You don't want to waste time kind of clicking through a folder structure where you have no idea what means what, trying to guess which thing that you kind of remember is in which file. And you also, gain valuable skills. Data management is a fairly hot topic, and by being at the cutting edge of it, by knowing what you're doing, you have a valuable transferable skill. There are plain economic reasons. Data is very costly to produce and valuable asset, and we should treat it as such. We should be careful with it. And also, you need money to produce the data, and often that money comes from grants, and in many cases, your grant-giving organizations will require that you do data management planning. So doing so and doing so properly is important for that. And finally, there are normative considerations. One, as social scientists, we're very concerned with keeping the people that work with us in our research participants, safe, both from, actual physical or economic harm, but also, from the slight embarrassment. If we promise them confidentiality, for example, we should actually be able to deliver on that. And then at the end, the most lofty but very important goal is better managed data produces better science. And that, of course, is why we're in the end all in this. And with that, I hand you over to Jesse.
Hi, everybody. So after discussing briefly with Sebastian why manage research data well, the next and most obvious question is how to do it. The way to think about good data management is to think about all the data steps as a subset of the research steps that a researcher would take during the course of the life cycle. And here is one of many renditions of the familiar concept or metaphor of the research life cycle. And so everything begins with good planning. This is the main takeaway here. And so we're going to spend a few minutes thinking about the data management plan as a document that records the decisions that the researcher needs to make from the beginning in order to plan for all the data steps throughout the whole research cycle. Here are a few links that when you get the slides, you'll be able to follow on your own if you're not already familiar with them. Several funders, as Sebastian said, have implemented a specific explicit expectation that a data management plan will accompany any funding proposal. These are just two of the examples: the National Science Foundation in the US and the UK Economic and Social Research Council. They have their own expectations and templates, but even if you're not submitting proposals to them and want to create a data management plan, there are other online tools that exist out there, which are basically questionnaires that lead the researcher through the types of issues that they need to think about in advance and answer for the course of their specific project. And as I said, by recording these decisions from the beginning, so by being forced to think about them and make decisions, but B, also record them, the researcher is in a better position to then implement those decisions. Of course, with the understanding that there is some flexibility, things do change in the course of research. But even when that happens, having had a plan to start with that then can be augmented or amended a little bit is still a better place to be in than making changes ad hoc and not having any record of them. So the importance of planning and recording the decisions and the plans are what we really want to emphasize here. There are, if you do go to some of these websites, there are also examples that you can see from real world projects, and I think that is very instructive and educational. We try to choose one specific example that involves qualitative data because that is not as common. Data management plans are not as common yet among qualitative researchers. So it's always good to see some illustrations and examples. So what are the types of questions, the types of issues that a researcher needs to think about from the beginning that will concern their data management practices throughout the research lifecycle? Well, they're very obvious. The types of data that are expected, so what kinds of data will be created, in what amounts, in what formats. Then the roles and responsibilities of the people, if any people that may be part of the project. So depending on the discipline, one may work by oneself, but also often may rely on local survey company or research assistants that transcribe the data, maybe other people who help with translation or anonymization. So every additional person that gets involved in the project needs to be assigned specific roles and responsibilities with respect to what portion of the data they will have access to, what their responsibilities for storage during the data collection might be, and what parts and versions of the data they may not be allowed to see if there are confidentiality issues, for example. Other types of questions that should be addressed and planned for from the data management planning stage are the appropriate restrictions on the data after they are shared, if sharing will be part of it, the period of data retention, any further plans for dissemination of both the results but also the data files themselves, and then storage and preservation in the long term, which if that aspect is going to be implemented, it usually involves working with a repository. So it's always great if that repository is identified in advance, if the researcher actually contacts the repository, and then, and I'm going to say this from our experience, but I'm sure all other data repositories operate the same way, we actually actively assist the researcher in answering some of the other questions that they may not be sure about, give them options, tell them what the repository can do, and are happy to be in contact with them during the course of their whole research. Another, I'm just going to mention the very last bullet point here. Another important reason why one may want to do a data management plan, even if not required by a funder, is that if the researcher engages in this planning process from the beginning, they can maybe assign some the time expectations and corresponding budget expectations for the time that it will take them to manage their data well. And it's always better to know this in advance and plan for it. As a more general kind of summary of the same questions, one needs to inform oneself about the legal and other obligations with respect to the data that they're collecting. That may become particularly, an illustration that may make this particularly clear is if you are collecting health data, for example, there are specific rules and federal or even international laws that might apply. And if you don't know them in advance, taking the time to educate yourself and apply them to your data management would be good to do in the beginning. Knowing one's own place of employment policies, they might impact how long, for example, data can be embargoed. Some universities have rules about that. The roles and responsibilities we already touched upon. And then especially in the case, again, when whole teams of researchers are working on the project, planning for review of the management as it actually occurs, as it happens during the data collection, is something else to include in the data management plan. Now, all of that needs to be documented. So the very act of recording in the data management plan becomes part of the documentation, and documentation is critical when managing data well. So just to give a very visual example of why data management might be important is these are some obviously obsolete and outdated forms of recording data, which for most of us, if we are faced with them today without any additional documentation, would be impossible to read, would be impossible, the contents would be impossible to access. And we don't tend to think in those terms of the format of the data formats and the ways of recording data that we're used to, but they always inevitably become obsolete. So recording these additional documentation details might help future researchers or one's own future self to make sense of such data, even if they're on obsolete formats. And then here the little chart is a slightly different point, but again, it's about naming conventions. If the naming convention is not thought out in the beginning and not described as part of the documentation files, making sense of final versus last one versus real version becomes very difficult. So those just two of the examples of the kinds of things, naming conventions, for example, or file formats that are part of the documentation. So I think we already made the point, why document your data and your processes? Well, it enables you, first of all, to understand the data when you return to them. As Sebastian said, it is frustrating and time-consuming to have to figure out all anew what you yourself did or what your team did, but it becomes even more difficult when other people who are not involved in the project from the beginning, when they are trying to make sense of the data. And related to that, many researchers are concerned about others that they share their data with misinterpreting them or misusing them. This becomes much more difficult for a secondary user to do if you've documented your data well and you've made it very clear where different things come from or what they stand for. So the guiding question during documentation should always be, what would a new user, somebody who was not part of the project from the beginning, what would they need to know to make sense of the data? There are various layers several layers on which things can be documented. So from the broadest kind of contextual information that one might want to record, which has to do with the research question itself, with publications that may be related to publications that may be related to the research question, user guides, questionnaires, those kinds of things sort of on the highest level. Then going through the data collection methodology and processes themselves. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but they're a small subset of all the relevant issues, and they will the relevant things to document will always depend on the particular project and on the particular methodology, but some illustrations are things like topic guides, interview scripts, description of the geographic coverage, if that's relevant to the question. Then in terms of analysis, you want to document some decisions that are made there, and so I'll just highlight here one qualitative example. If you are coding your collected data as part of the analysis, you want to record, obviously, all the coding decisions, and that would then become additional part of the documentation that helps others make sense of it. So those are sort of some of the meso level details to be documented. Then things like data file structures, again, the connection with naming conventions becomes clear here. Variable level documentation, if variables are isolated already as part of the data collection process. And then more important to our general topic here today about safety and security, things like data confidentiality, access and use conditions. If you're working with human participants and if promising confidentiality is important and it will be achieved, for example, through anonymization, you want to think about the anonymization rules that you're going to apply. You want to record them in an anonymization protocol. That becomes an additional documentation file. You want to record the consent script or forms that may have been used with the participant. You want to think about the eventual access conditions of data that you may want to apply, again, if you are sharing the data in the end. So those are the various levels on which documentation should be recorded. And then it's always, as we said, very important to start thinking about these things from the beginning, to include them and embed them as part of the data management plan, even if at that early stage you can't go to the level of detail that you will eventually actually implement. But to get an early start with documentation is imperative. And here I am going to just take the time to read what's on the slide. Good documentation and metadata, about which we're going to talk in a second, depend on what you can provide, what information you can provide. What you can provide depends on what you can remember. And so in order to remember the most and all the relevant information, you need to start as early on in the research. You need to start documenting things and writing down the information from as early on in the research process as possible. Documentation, in other words, is what ties the original plan, which itself is a document, right, the documentation file, to the actual in the field or in the lab implementation. as well as any of the necessary adjustments that are then made. Those need to be recorded and documented as well. Here we just have a few more sort of examples and suggestions of documentation that can happen not on the broader contextual level about the project or about the data collection sites, but actually with documentation that can be embedded within the data files themselves, and that's helpful too. Again, think about if you are sharing these data, you want people to be able to tie the file, tie the data file to you, to your project, to the place and time when, for example, an interview took place. So these are some examples of, excuse me, documentation bits that can be embedded within the data. Sorry, I should have maybe said here something about Excel files, which people often use, and they're good for certain types of data recording, but they should also be very well documented. Worksheets should be labeled. The document itself should have all its metadata properties. And one striking statistic that comes out of this article that you can find via the DOI says that 20% of scientific papers on genes contain gene name conversion errors that are caused by Excel. So we should know also what formats are appropriate for what and where documentation should really happen so that it's maximally useful. From our qualitative context, I'll give an example here again how some bits may be embedded in the data file. This is actually from a project shared via the Qualitative Data Repository. And the person did a very good job that, even before they encountered us, before they had thought about data sharing, they had recorded their some of the contextual information about their interviews as part of each data file. And just so that we don't, so that we answer any questions that you may have about confidentiality here, confidentiality was not an issue because this person was actually interviewing high-profile politicians in South American countries. So it was not just not an issue, but it was important to record who the person was that was being interviewed. And then metadata, which I mentioned, which to many of you who are information professionals of various sorts is not an unfamiliar word, but for researchers it may be. And metadata is nothing more than data about the data. It's really highly structured documentation about the data. And that the metadata become more important again when a researcher is planning to share their materials with a repository. The repository would need to create certain metadata so that it is so that the data files are easily discoverable and searchable and citable and so on. But if the researcher has done a good job documenting where, by whom, when the various pieces of the data were created, what they are about, provide little description, have informative names to each file, if that is already the case, then the repository would have a much easier job and will be able to help the depositor to create the more technical expression of this information, which again is what metadata is, without too much of an additional burden. Here is just again to illustrate the importance of metadata, an example from QDR's catalog. These are the kinds of things that are part of the metadata, well, at least the part of the substantive metadata that a human can also read. There are other bits that are more or exclusively machine readable, but nothing that a researcher should not be able to provide. And again, if they've documented it from the beginning, nothing that they will need to provide beyond their original documentation. Things like geography tags, topic or keywords, time of the data or time span of the data collection, the temporal coverage that the data actually provide, and access conditions, those sorts of things that we already mentioned. Here we're going into the third portion of our webinar, but one aspect that already was alluded to, which is the protections of human participants. It becomes particularly critical for qualitative researchers because both the qualitative data are very likely to be produced in direct interaction with humans, but also because some of the technical solutions for anonymization and providing confidentiality that might be applied for quantitative data just can't work or don't work as well, can't be applied as mechanistically when it comes to qualitative data. So again, thinking about these things, the ethical concerns and the corresponding legal obligations to human participants, thinking about those in advance is helpful so that the researcher plans ahead how they're going to ensure the confidentiality and privacy of their human participants. This is just here, obviously, we're just telegraphing some of these points. We can have a whole other webinar just on ensuring active consent and well-informed consent. But the idea is that the research must be designed and undertaken to ensure integrity, quality, and transparency in the researchers' interaction with their participants. And these decisions that they've made regarding ethical obligations need to be documented, which then provides integrity, quality, and transparency of the data when they're shared ultimately with the broader research community. Promises for confidentiality and anonymity first should be, thought about. Are they always necessary? To what degree are they necessary? But then once promised, they must be respected. Participation of the people that one is interviewing or interacting with in other forms must always be not just voluntary, but must be made clear to the participants that it is voluntary and free of any coercion. Harm to participants of any sort, even reputational harm, needs to be avoided, and conflicts of interest of the researcher must be made explicit so that that really ensures truly informed consent for the participant. For all of these things, having taken the time in advance to plan becomes critical. So here again, just telegraphing a couple of solutions that we propose to some of our researchers who've contacted us early enough in the process of their data collection. For example, the fact that oftentimes identifying information, which is ultimately what needs to be taken out if the person is going to be anonymizing qualitative data, some of that information doesn't really need to be collected. So if the researcher hasn't thought about that and has very kind of, for administrative purposes, somewhat thoughtlessly recorded people's names and email addresses as part of the interview transcript or their interview notes, then they need to take extra time and remove those and anonymize and so on. But if they've thought about it in advance and kept the directly identifying information separate or not collected at all, if that is appropriate for their context, then their task of providing confidentiality becomes easier. Then that whole process of informed consent that we briefly touched upon needs to be documented as well, even if the consent is going to be asked only in the verbal interaction, and the researcher is not going to ask people to maybe sign forms because that's considered inappropriate in their context. Even so, the consent script that they present should be documented somewhere from the beginning. And the one thing that we particularly would like to emphasize to researchers, or those of you who work with researchers would hope that you emphasize for them, make those decisions in advance, how exactly you're going to provide confidentiality and protection for the participants, but do not preclude data sharing, and in fact ask for it explicitly as part of the informed consent process, and record that in your IRB application. So an IRB group is likely to actually accept your request that you're going to share the data at the end if you have also presented evidence that you've thought about how that can be done in a safe and legal manner. They're not likely to reject that request, as some researchers might fear. But again, the planning step is key. And this was all, the previous points were all about doing things during the data collection process, maybe during the data analysis. But here, it carries over to the publication or data sharing stage, if that is something that the researcher will do. One caveat that I actually wanted to make is people sometimes think that when we talk about data sharing and data publication, that this means indiscriminately making available their qualitative data, and that obviously becomes impossible if one conceives of it in that way. That is not what we as a research repository mean. What we mean it by publishing and sharing it is doing it in the appropriate way, which means where sensitive data are concerned, applying a number of additional management steps. For example, anonymization, or even potentially access controls that Sebastian is going to talk about in a second. Here, I just wanted to show very quickly again how anonymization with qualitative materials cannot happen in any automated way, but we can rely on the deep contextual knowledge of the researchers themselves to provide the appropriate anonymization steps. So I will.
We actually have a question. You want to read it?
Okay, apparently we have a question, so let's read that if it's related to this section. Based on your experience, feedback from researchers, what effect does requesting data sharing have on participants' willingness to participate in qualitative research, especially on sensitive topics or on projects where high levels of rapport between researchers and participants is an important part of the research process? That is, in fact, an interesting question, and one that people who haven't engaged in data sharing are always worried about. Is telling my participants that I'm going to share their data, is it going to make them not want to participate, not want to answer my questions, or is it going to impact even the way that they respond? So there are other people, not Qualitative Data Repository, but other places that have done research on that question. So I can share some materials actually after the webinar that shows that even with what we would consider sensitive data, so one example that comes to mind, I think it was regarding people's experiences with close relatives who have passed away from cancer and their grieving process. So from many perspectives, those are sensitive data, personal data, certainly. People who were explicitly asked to participate in such research with the understanding that the data will be shared did not drop out of the process and were willing to do it. There are other such examples. So obviously we can never tell with certainty that it's not going to impact the selection process. But from the empirical studies that we have, or from our admittedly still very short experience advising people to do that, we haven't seen any negative impact. So that's what I'm going to say for the moment. Sebastian will take it up from here, and he may say a little more to that. But thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's a highly relevant and very interesting question. And in addition to what Desi pointed out, in that there are reasons why people actually want their data shared, because they take the time to talk with you, which is often valuable time, so they want to have the maximum impact. There's also ways you can make sure that you aren't affected by a backlash, so to speak, right? So one thing that we have actually worked on with researchers is gradual levels of consents. So you ask people, are you okay if I use this for my research as the basic step, and then kind of have more steps. Can I use this anonymously and share it? And people can say no, and if they say no, that's perfectly fine. And then you don't make that, say, interview transcript available. And we are not, we think sharing data is great, but we are also social scientists, and we think having interesting research is in the end our main goal. So we would never tell people, if you can't get shareable data, don't do your research. If your research participants don't want to have their stories publicly shared, or if there's very real risk, that needs to be taken into account. And if that means not sharing certain transcripts, that's obviously the right thing to do. You should not have your research design be affected by shareability. I want to take up how we think about publishing sensitive data on the repository side, but this actually also applies to those of you working in larger organizations. As Desi alluded to, when we think about quantitative data, and I should flag, this is the so-called 5S framework that UK Data developed. We use this more as a conceptual framework. They have this tied to specific policies and technologies. And we have a link to a great 3-minute or 5-minute YouTube video on this. So for quantitative data, we're actually now, thanks to technology, able to do some very sophisticated things where we mask data, where we give people slightly distorted data, where we limit what type of regressions, say, people can run on data. So we can make sensitive data fairly safe through the ways in which we provide access. With qualitative data, because there's so much contextual information in the data, so if you think back to our Spanish transcripts that we had here, we're fairly sure that our anonymization is good enough to keep anyone with even close knowledge of Argentine politics from being able to identify those people. But there are interviews with figures of speeches, with manner of speech, etc. So their friends and colleagues would have a good chance of potentially identifying who the interview participant is. So for qualitative data, we think that it's really key that if you share sensitive data, so data that is both potentially problematic if it gets de-identified and can potentially be de-identified, think about what UK data called safe projects. So what is the data being used for? And one way to assure that is to request so-called secondary IRBs in the US lingo for research ethics protocol. So if you want to analyze that data, you have to demonstrate that you have thought about the ethics, that you have clearance from your institution, and then safe people. So make sure that whoever accesses the data has the appropriate training and the appropriate integrity. And that's where this links back. If you do research in a larger organization, and I know we have a bunch of people from research organization here, you want to think about who has access to the data internally. You want to make sure that those people are properly trained. So that links back to the idea of being clear about roles and responsibilities. Now to the horror scenarios. Right, I should mention, and this is looking with me reproachfully, we can, and at the repository level, like any data repository, we can allow access at various levels, right? This starts with just checking that the people are actually have a research project and aren't just people who want to browse random data with no specific purpose, which can be fine, but not for sensitive data, to the point where we will not put the data online at all and only allow access in a supervised room on a computer cut off from the internet. So there's various levels of access that a data repository can also assure, and principally that if you want to implement them at your institution to most degrees, you could probably find protocols to do that as well. Okay, now to the horror scenarios. This is obviously an actual image, but this type of stuff happens, not just when people shoot your laptop, but also when more mundane stuff like theft or hard disk crashes happen. So let's spend some time talking about backup. People, before this happens to them the first time, tend to be overconfident, but it happens to pretty much everyone. I've certainly had a hard disk fail on me kind of 2 months before dissertation deadline. Digital media are quite fallible, and fallible in numerous ways. They can just break entirely, but you can also get individual files corrupted, especially if you store it for a while. And so you want to be very thorough and have a good idea of how to protect yourself against all the various problems. And I have, and this is kind of common security protocols, 2 rules of thumb that in most situations will keep you safe. You want to have 3 versions of every important piece of data of every file, and you want to have those in 2 locations. And so a standard setup is that you have the first copy, of course, on your computer, the second copy on a local backup, and the third copy on some version of network or cloud-based backup. And to the extent that you have a good IT department, they will help you with that, and they're usually quite paranoid, rightly so, about data loss, so they'll be able to give you good guidance. The second thing about backups is that you do not want to rely on yourself for making them. You want to have this set up automatically. You want to have this to happen regularly, depending on what you're working on, at least daily, if not hourly. Mac Time Machine or similar programs can do that. And you want them to be incremental. That's the idea of, sometimes referred to as version control, that you can't just go back to one version of the file, but you can kind of go back in time and look at what happened to the file over time. And again, good backup software and many cloud syncing options that we're going to talk about next actually automate that. But think about this from the beginning, have a good protocol, and be safe about this. Cloud storage services. We love cloud storage. We use it ourselves. It's incredibly convenient because it happens automatically and in the background, and it syncs, and it has version control and all these nice things. They save lots of people's butts, and they're amazing, but the typical services may not be appropriate for sensitive data. In many cases, and that applies to almost everyone who isn't in the US, it may actually be against the law to store personally identifiable research data on cloud storage devices. But even if it's not breaking laws, it's very likely a bad idea. So for example, if you put a file on Dropbox, technically a Dropbox employee can open that file and look at that file. They hopefully don't, but you have absolutely no guarantees. And you know, depending on the nature of your research, government or other people who might be interested in the data certainly can get access to them. There are ways to mitigate them. One is to encrypt the data locally, right? There are tools like PGP encryption, BitLocker on Windows, and tons of other tools that all essentially work the same way. They encrypt the data locally, and so even if you sync it to the cloud, whoever accesses it there can't do much with it. The downside of those is depending on the service, they might impose inconveniences. So you do have to, you know, think about the trade-off there, and so we've seen kind of in government where the trade-off gets often pushed too far on the security side, people then use alternative means of communication of data storage with unfortunate consequences. The other alternative, and that one is actually very user-friendly, is to look for services similar to Dropbox or Google Drive, but that offer end-to-end encryption. That means the data is encrypted before you send it to the server and then decrypted on your computer as it gets sent back. Those are slightly less secure than encrypting locally, but they are virtually indistinguishable from the user perspective from generally cloud storage. So very good idea for kind of if you have like medium security type of data that you're not paranoid about, but other people shouldn't get their hands on. Very briefly about data destruction. We do not like to talk about data destruction. We're a data repository. We really don't want you to destroy your data. We ask you to not write into your grant applications and your IOB applications that at the end you will destroy your data. There are almost always way to at least, you know, put a long embargo on it, do something, don't destroy it. However, if you did say you will destroy your data, or, and that's hopefully the more likely scenario, if you want to pass on the equipment on which your data was stored, there's a couple of things to remember. Deleting a file from a hard drive is completely pointless in terms of actually removing it. This is run-of-the-mill software that shows you deleted files on a hard disk. And as you can see, their contents are completely still visible. And you don't even need particularly fancy computer knowledge or of any type. You can just do that with freely available software. So just, you know, putting it in the trash won't cut it. There are specialized softwares, and you've seen those probably, file or folder shredding software, and what they do is they actually overwrite the specific sector of the hard disk, usually with a bunch of zeros, and they do it 3 times, and it takes a long time, but it's fairly safe. So for your run-of-the-mill data, before you, you know, don't use your computer, throw out your hard disk, that's a viable solution. But if your data is actually super sensitive, it's not enough. So the National Institute for for science and technology actually has guidelines for what you do when you have highly sensitive data and you give them the data outside of the hard disk outside of your institution, and the guidelines are to disintegrate, pulverize, melt, and incinerate, which I get a lot of pleasure out of saying. Because you stuck with us for these 45 minutes, you get the rewards of seeing the incinerate part of these instructions. And there we go. And this again it's actually a very nice BBC series that describes both this theory and has some fun little details like incinerating hard drives in it. That is how you deal with the hardest cases. I want to conclude with some more happier thoughts. So if you didn't destroy your data, we would love to work with you, with researchers, with you in archiving qualitative data. As I hope we've made clear, we do this not just for data that can be freely shared. We don't think every little piece of data needs to be shared in order for a data collection to be valuable. So we handle all types of different cases, and we'd love to work with you or researchers that you work with on archiving their data. And as I hope we've emphasized often enough during this webinar, we'd love for them to get in touch early, because again, the earlier they think about these issues, the earlier they're in touch with us, the more we can assist them, and the better and the easier the actual deposit and archiving and hopefully sharing of their data works. And with that, we have about 10 minutes left for questions. I'm gonna wait a while. Yes, so Stefan mentioned data tags, and data tags is a really interesting project that automates access levels or semi-automates access levels based on sensitivity interviews that are computer-guided sensitivity interviews, and then classifies the documents and then provides the right type of access conditions and security conditions. And so yeah, we're actually hoping to get data tags implemented on our data repository, and it's a great project. Do we have specific guidelines, recommendations for researchers who undertake ethnographic research with indigenous populations? So indigenous populations are always the single hardest case for these types of issues, and most of the time, our experience is that, well, there's actually two sides to this. On the one hand, the most indigenous populations, certainly in the US and in Canada, will not transfer quote unquote ownership of their data outside of their communities. For good reasons, they've seen enough exploitations. They don't want outside researchers coming in and then taking out something out of value out of their communities. On the other hand, they are often interested in preserving their stories. And so what we would recommend, and we haven't gotten to a point where that has happened, but what we would recommend is talking to the people you're working with in that context and seeing if they would be interested in setting up something, maybe in collaboration with a data repository, but under control of a tribal council or something, or under complete control of the tribal council for data sharing. And there are examples of that actually happening. But it's an obviously sensitive topic. There's been a lot of harm done by researchers inside indigenous communities. And you want to tread very lightly on that territory. Yes, best practices for keeping identifiers separate from the data. It kind of depends partly, I guess, on your environment, right? So if you're in the field and you're concerned that people may, raid your hotel room, um, that's a trickier issue than if you are, say, local and have like a local office that is secure, where you can then just, have keys on the interviews and have a separate list that's not stored on this same machine. Um, and that is a little cumbersome, right? Um, but do you have anything else on that topic, Desi? We haven't dealt, to be quite honest, with the very hard cases, and I would guess that quantitative repositories have possibly more experience on this, but
yeah, I was trying to think if any of our actual depositors have been in that situation, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. Again, if it is for qualitative data, presumably you don't have an unmanageable number of files, so then it really should be maybe preferable to keep the direct identifiers in some kind of format that is different from the digital format of the data files themselves. Again, that may become more difficult if you have thousands of cases, but typically the people that we deal with have fewer than that, and so it's more manageable to have, maybe a hard copy version of the direct identifiers that you store in, as Sebastian said, in your locked office where nobody else has access. But that really depends also on the data collection context and scenario. So in many of these cases, the general guidance that we give may be modified according to the specifics of a project. If you have, again, for yourself, you said you're a health researcher. If you are starting to plan a new project where that may be an issue, get in touch with us and we'll try to think through these steps with you. That hopefully is helpful.
Great question by Kristen here. So how do we deal with low-tech people or low-tech patients, folks? The recommendation would be to think through easy workflows and work with templates as much as possible. I think those would be my two recommendations, right? Like things like starting at the data management plan, like working with the DMP tool or something like that guides you through the planning procedure, having a clear template for interviews that they can just follow without, having to deal with complicated technology, to, working with your IT people to having easy to use automated backup strategies. So that for the researcher and all of us in the data management community obviously think about making these workflows easy and not, requiring high tech and not requiring tons of time investment. So those would be my two recommendations: templates and try to anticipate workflows to make them as easy as possible. If you have any particular thing that you find people struggling with, can maybe say more about that. It's a great question, though.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, Desi, I think, may have something.
It's not, I don't know again how well that's going to go with the people that you have in mind, what I'm going to say, but so we haven't had to deal with too many cases like that of people who are currently planning or are in the process of collecting data and they insist on doing it on paper. That we haven't dealt with, but we have dealt with several what we call legacy collections. So people who've already done all their data collection and and wanted to share it in some form, but basically sent us these big boxes full of paper. So based on those experiences, what I can advise people that are at the stage where they could be swayed away from paper is that it's going to be much more time consuming and much more difficult for them to work with a repository, to work with, in our case, for example, to work with us. We'll keep going back to them with many questions, with many decisions that have to be made for digitization purposes and naming files, then something that they didn't have to do obviously when they worked on paper. So it's just going to be a much more involved, much more costly and time consuming process. So if they want to save themselves all these additional burdens, they would be better off working even with a very low tech but digital solution. That's sort of what I would try to say and highlight.
Yeah, right. I mean, I guess it would be a carrot and a stick, right? You praise the advantages of having stuff digitally, searchability, etc., and then your stick would be to scare the bejesus out of them, like gather up horror stories of people having their research notebooks stolen and no backup, and having lost 2 years of ethnographic data. And if neither of those were excited, you're out of luck. All right, we are exactly at 1 hour. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to take that last question if PLM is actually still typing. Oh no, that was just a thanks. We're exactly at 1 hour. I'm going to end the recording now. We will be back in touch with the link to both the recording and the slides. Thank you again for your interest, and encourage you to be in touch or have your researchers be in touch. And with that, have a good Thursday afternoon, morning, or evening.